Hello everybody, my name is Rachel. Welcome to another weekly reading wrap-up. I finished 5 books this past week and I enjoyed all of them. There were no real duds this week, which is good. That's an improvement over the past couple of weeks. So let's get into it. The first book is The Man Who Fell to Earth by Walter Tevis. This is a science fiction novel from 1963 about a man from Mars who comes to Earth to make a fortune so that he can save his people. I'm actually going to do a separate review of this book because I had enough to say about it. I really enjoyed it, even though it's a real bummer of a story. It is well written and well told though, and yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I think I will seek out the other book by Tevis in the SF Masterworks line. After that, I finished The Faceless Old Woman Who Secretly Lives in Your Home by Joseph Fink and Jeffrey Cranor. This is the third and latest Welcome to Night Vale novel. However, it doesn't actually take place in Night Vale for the most part, and I don't think it feels like a Night Vale novel, which made me a little bit sad. This is the backstory to the Faceless Old Woman, who has been one of my favorite characters on the podcast for a long time. She's voiced by Mara Wilson, who also does the audiobook. And that's probably the number one thing I enjoyed about this, is Wilson's narration was just so beautiful. I really enjoyed listening to it. But this story mostly takes place in, I think, the late 1700s, early 1800s, or around there, and it's a historical fiction tale of revenge and piracy and smugglers, and finally telling you how the Faceless Old Woman turned out to be kind of an immortal old woman without a face, who's kind of invisible and people can't see her when she lives in their homes. Like, what is her deal? So mostly this book is just the Faceless Old Woman telling you her story, her family, what she did, what happened, and then periodically it cuts to present-day Night Vale, where she is speaking to a man named Craig, and that eventually makes more sense because the two parts meet. I actually wasn't a big fan of how the past met up with the present. I really enjoy the Faceless Old Woman as a creepy character. There are just some really creepy things about, what she does. She lives in people's homes and they can't see her. But I felt like the end of this book, which explained what she was currently doing, was less creepy and more just sadistic and messed up. And I have never felt that way about a Night Vale character before. Even like the story arc with like the people from Desert Bluffs and the Smiling God and everything, I didn't feel like those characters were necessarily malicious, but in this case, the Faceless Old Woman is kind of malicious, and not in a fun, creepy way either. So on the whole, I enjoyed the book for what it was, which is mostly historical fiction for the majority of it, and kind of lost interest by the end. I think this is a case of sometimes you can know too much about a favorite character and then they're not really mysterious and special anymore. So this one, it doesn't really feel like a Night Vale novel, and I think people's mileage will vary with it depending on how you feel already about the Faceless Old Woman. Next is Wildlife by Molly Gloss. This is one of the Otherwise Award winners, but I'm probably not going to do a separate review of it because this one didn't speak to me as much as the previous 2 books that I read by Gloss. I've already done reviews of Outside the Gates and Dazzle of Day, which are 2 stories that really have stuck with me. They really hit me emotionally and they got under my skin. Wildlife is just as beautifully written. I still think the concept and the characters and what it's saying are all interesting, but it is not going to be as memorable for me. So I'll probably talk about this again in a future Otherwise Award batch wrap up, but I will give some thoughts here anyway. So Wildlife is set in 1902. It's mostly the diary entries of a woman named Charlotte Bridger Drummond. She is a single mother of 5 young boys living in the Pacific Northwest, and I believe it's like modern day Oregon. And she joins a search party for her housekeeper's missing granddaughter. The granddaughter was taken by her father to a logging camp because they're in the middle of logging country, and then she disappeared from that camp, and somebody says that they think a Sasquatch took her. Charlotte rushes out eventually to join the search party because she's not gonna be one of those women who just sits at home waiting for the bad news. Charlotte is a radical feminist, the type of woman who walks around chomping a cigar and wearing men's clothing, and takes every opportunity possible to give people tracts on women's rights, basically. And so she joins the search party. It's not looking really good. They're not finding the little girl. And then she becomes separated from the other people and spends 6 weeks surviving in the Oregon wilderness and basically untouched land, and she encounters the band of Sasquatches. What is the point of this book? And that's what I thought so much at the end, is what is the point of this? I thought at the beginning that it was going to be very much a feminist story with Charlotte making some sort of point about her role, her actions compared to other women, and helping other women. That didn't really seem to be the case. In fact, I think one of the most disappointing things about the book overall for me is that Charlotte isn't really likable, and she doesn't really like other women. She's very harsh towards other women, especially when she judges them for not basically taking control enough, for not being in more control of their situation and doing things, without realizing that she's in a really privileged position. Most of the other women in the story, like Melba and her daughter, down to her granddaughter, are pretty helpless. They don't have options, you know? So I really didn't enjoy Charlotte's attitude towards other women, and I don't think the story was ultimately about that. At the end, or near the end, I thought that it was a story about how this really intense woman who's full of vim and vigor and bravado kind of learns to fear other people. She's never been afraid of other people. She's never been afraid of men. And now she comes out the other side of this ordeal or this adventure being afraid of other people, being afraid of being alone with men. And that is a little bit soul-crushing, but also realistic. And then you have this whole through line of the story, which is looking for the lost girl. What happened to her? What is up with the Sasquatches? And then I think I landed on the actual point of the book. It's not necessarily about the characters, it's about the wilderness. This is about the wildlife that Charlotte gets to experience at a time when wildlife and wilderness are being destroyed. They're rapidly disappearing as humans are moving in and cutting down the trees and destroying the habitats. This beautiful, pristine, wild world is becoming a rarity. So I think this book is equal parts historical fiction and nature writing. And I did enjoy that aspect because Gloss is a fantastic writer, and she really evokes that sense of place and the beauty of the natural world. And seeing it this way, someone who just dumped into it and is struggling to survive, struggling to find enough food, and yet also enjoying being there and being taken away from it at the end, is a little bit of a loss, I guess. So it's a pretty complicated book that I think is heavier on the experience than it is on the plot, perhaps. So yeah, it's a pretty complicated novel that was really good, but I didn't connect with it nearly as much as I did with Gloss's other books. Next is The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. This is her latest novel, a contemporary fantasy novel set in New York City. And I love the concept of this. I've encountered this in other stories, I think, but I love the idea. It's that when cities become big enough and culturally rich enough, they've amassed enough stuff that they are born. They have a personality, they have a personification, they have this human avatar. And this is about New York City, its birth, and it doesn't just have one avatar, it has 6. It has a primary for the city overall, and then one for each of the 5 boroughs. And something is trying to thwart the birth of cities. There have been stillbirths in the past and more failures. So what is happening to New York City during the birthing process is very unusual. This enemy, the woman in white from like another dimension, is trying to like subvert all of the avatars and stop the city and like crush it from existence, basically. And the various people who wake up and realize that they are part of the city, they have to find each other and then find the primary who has been badly hurt trying to defend the city. And I felt like this took me on a wild ride of all the major parts of New York City. This is probably the first novel I've ever read that actually made me care about New York City. I've never been really drawn to it as the idea of the place or the culture or anything. And I've never really understood what the city is like and the various parts of it and how they work, I guess. So it was really interesting to see each of these places, you know, the Bronx, Queens, Manhattan, personified in people with, these personalities that really explain what they're like. That was really interesting. And just overall, I liked the idea. It feels a little bit like a setup novel because most of it is just people trying to figure out what's going on and get through a single stage, and then it's done. I would have been disappointed at the end if it had been pitched as a standalone. I would have asked, okay, but we just got through the beginning part, where's the rest of the story? But now that I know it's gonna be a series, I think it works better. The difficult thing about this book, and what may be a bit polarizing, I guess, is that it's really about the racism and prejudices and everyday problems that a lot of these characters go through, because all of the avatars are people of color, Black, Indigenous, mixed, except for one. And one of the ways that the enemy tries to thwart them is by manipulating normal people and using their prejudices, their biases against the people of color. And I think it was a little bit more difficult to read right now, as all of those issues are currently a big like global public conversation. It's difficult to read this and just experience it as fiction when you know it is reality. Like the aspect of like racists trying to dox people working at this art center, knowing full well that that's something that Jemisin herself has had to deal with. It was really stressful. I found that the story was immersive and I could just really get into it, and I had to take breaks because the stress of these aggressive racist behaviors is really getting to me. And I think that is something that maybe people a couple of months ago reading this book would have been like, this is a bit much, but now reading it in the middle of the protests and the Black Lives Matter movement, it suddenly feels very of the moment and like it's making a point. So it was good. I really want the next book. I really want to know what's going to happen next with the characters all now knowing who they are, knowing who the other people are, and hopefully working together. I will say that's the other thing that kind of bothered me a little bit, is I thought almost all of the characters in this were really disagreeable and they did not get along. And that is probably because they are aspects of New York City. I will say that's probably a bit intentional, but I thought they were really unpleasant to each other in ways that were uncalled for some of the time. I think I wanted some friendlier characters, but that's asking for something that perhaps was never intended in the first place, so I'll leave it at that. So yeah, I liked this. I don't think it was nearly as good as the Broken Earth trilogy, but I am excited for the next one. The last thing I have to talk about this week is The AI Who Loved Me by Alyssa Cole. This is a science fiction romance novella. I've been meaning to read something by Alyssa Cole for a while now, and when I was looking for a different one of her romance novels, I found this and thought, that sounds like my sort of thing. It is definitely very science fictional. It's very heavy on the futuristic setting, the kind of sentient home devices, the spread of technology, surveillance, and these like hive corporations that seem to control everything, including governments. The main character is a woman named Trinity. She's formerly a data analyst. Something traumatic happened to her at work at one of the corporations, and she is now working from home while still processing what happened to her. And she encounters her neighbor's really hot nephew one day. His name is Li Wei, and he initially just kind of stares at her and he doesn't say anything, and then slowly begins talking more and interacting with her more. They're very taken with each other, and their relationship very quickly progresses to being like physical and hot and heavy and everything. That bothered me at first until there was an actual explanation for why things happened so quickly. This was overall okay. Li Wei is obviously the AI of the title. That's not a spoiler, it's pretty obvious. There were like two things that kind of bugged me about this. The first is in the world building. I thought that the science fiction aspect of this was way overbaked. It felt artificial, like it wasn't very natural, possibly because it was so much all at once thrown at you, like really heavy info dumping in something that's only a novella length, so it was a lot to take in and to remember and to think about like the implications of all the technology and like AIs everywhere. My favorite character was actually Penny, who's like the AI surveillance system in the apartment complex, and everyone seemed to keep forgetting she was around watching what they were doing all the time, which kind of seemed like a plot hole. You know, like think about the implications. Think it all the way through. The other thing that kind of bugged me is the dynamics at first. Li Wei has also experienced a traumatic event, and he's been like completely reset. So at the first half of the story, he's an infant AI. He has very poor verbal skills, he doesn't have any interpersonal skills, he's clueless about a lot of things, and he's only slowly regaining his memories. And throw like this kind of like childlike innocent person into a physical relationship with a much more adult character, that was weird. I would have vastly preferred it if Li Wei had just been completely himself from the beginning, but I don't know. Just, I wasn't really keen on that. So yeah, those two things meant I didn't super love this. I think it was pretty interesting though, and the way it ended, clearly there's going to be another story, and I might read it when it comes out. But for now, I'm going to explore some of Cole's. And that is it for this week. A bunch of things that I enjoyed, even if a few of them won't stick with me forever. Definitely an improvement over previous weeks. So with that, let me know if you have read any of these books, or if you want to, let me know what you think. Leave a comment down below. I'll be back to talk to you again very soon, and until then, bye.